Welcome to the Pillar Podcast, where we put racial equity front and center. Join us as we dissect equity policy, overcoming achievement gaps, and strategies that ensure equitable learning opportunities, experiences, and outcomes for all students.
Former principal of
Yeah.
So I've been following you a little bit, BJ. And to my understanding, you have a daughter.
I have two.
You have two daughters.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. One named Naya.
One named Naya.
Naya is a student at DuPont Manual.
Yes, she's a senior there this year and will be attending the University of Texas at Austin next year.
Yeah, I hear that. I saw a tweet that says something of the effect of she's 6'3", quick, has wingspan, plays with quick tempo, and is the best at every position, according to the PD 2023 national rankings.
Well, yeah, she plays volleyball.
Yeah.
And so she kind of stepped away from the tradition of our family, which has been steeped in basketball. And so my father and my uncles all play basketball, myself, several of my cousins all play basketball, college, and some professionally overseas, such as myself. And yeah, she decided she didn't want to go that path, and she wanted to pursue something else. And my only stipulation was that she was involved in something extracurricular, and I wanted her to try something sports related. And so she decided to pursue volleyball, which is, worked out pretty well for her.
Yeah, I will say so. Is that how they would have described you on the basketball court?
I was athletic and I could play. My game was versatile. I could do a lot of different things. So similar to her in her sport, I had injuries, unfortunately, that kind of sidelined my playing career. And, I pray that she remains healthy as she continues to prosper in that avenue in terms of volleyball. So, we'll see. But I would say she's probably a little bit more athletic than I was. I was an athlete, but she's an exceptional athlete.
Yeah, she's getting it, man. I'm happy for her, happy for you. So
yeah, thank you.
That's awesome. So, BJ, as executive administrator for DEP, your primary responsibility is monitoring the racial equity plans for central office and the schools within the district, amongst, I'm sure, a list of other things dictated from our chief marshal. Mm-hmm. Second year in this role, correct?
Yes.
And we had this conversation last year, and we talked about some of the metrics that are used in the racial equity plan that are tied to our 5 tenets that make up the racial equity policy.
Right.
Of the 23 metrics that are used when we're monitoring progress towards the district's racial equity plan, you briefly mentioned last year increasing the number of courses that are offered that pertain to different cultural perspectives, increasing the number of students that participate in those courses, increasing the number of staff that participate in culturally responsive professional developments and Title I funding. What are some of the other metrics that are used in monitoring the racial equity plan?
Sure. As you stated we have 23 metrics that we monitor as a district as it relates to racial equity. A few others would be the sense of belonging for our students of color. One of the new ones that we added this year was increasing the sense of trust from our families of color, which we get that data from the Comprehensive School Survey along with the sense of belonging data. We look at our contracts, MWBE.
Okay.
Contracts is another one to make sure minority and women business owners, entrepreneurs are getting their fair shake in terms of contracts with the district. And so we monitor those numbers. We monitor our retention numbers for our teachers of color. We also monitor our hires of administrators and also teachers of color within our district. So those are just a few additional that we take a look at to make sure, not just with our curriculum instruction, like you mentioned, the cultural perspective courses, but also those other metrics as well to make sure we're well-rounded as a district in terms of the racial equity work.
Yeah, and then I was under the impression a lot of the hiring is, as you allude to with Dr. Stephanie White, I just assumed that was just something embedded in her role, but that's actually a focal point.
It definitely is. And so Stephanie does a phenomenal job of working with our principals and then also our human resources department, as well as our zone leadership in terms of the hiring process. And so she has gone out on recruiting trips with our human resources department as well to help extend our arms into other states and the community to try to bring in more diverse teachers and also administrators into the district. She helps with DeJuan Williams Score Equity Screener, which is a tool that helps capture the racial equity work that potential candidates are currently doing in their station. And so she provides insight and feedback on that. And then she also provides support for our school level leaders, our principals, and the hiring process. So helping them develop questions as they seek to hire more diverse individuals into their schools.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Minority and Women Business Enterprise, and I know a lot of that work is led by Delquan Dorsey. I know we have a interview planned for, I think, next week or maybe 2 weeks, but I'm looking forward to having a conversation with him. He always has his ear to the ground and knows what's going on with our minority businesses. So definitely grateful for his work.
Right.
And so you work with and have a number of specialists on your team, specifically anti-race specialists. I know them pretty well myself, Avon Cook, Amanda Moore Rodriguez, and Rachel Klein. Just phenomenal individuals themselves, but I think very, very bold and tenacious in their professional careers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I know their work ties directly into one of the 5 tenets of the racial equity policy. And so when data comes back and there's been, let's say, little to no growth within a particular metric, right? They give advice, maybe provide strategy or direction on how to improve a certain metric. How does BJ or the Diversity, Equity, and Poverty Department ensure what's being suggested by those specialists get utilized within a teacher's pedagogy or classroom, school community?
Yeah. So the tenet that they are predominantly working in and responsible for, those 3 anti-racist specialists, is curriculum instruction and assessment. And so that's where they lay their anchor a lot of times. And so their work in past years is centered around developing what we call Black Experienced Teacher Institute, or BETI. And that's a cohort of teachers that they have worked with to help develop culturally responsive curriculum. And also our team of Teachers for Equity, which is TOTE, same thing. Just a small cohort of teachers that are responsible for producing culturally responsive curriculum and getting those sample lessons and units into the hands of our educators throughout the district. In addition to that, our anti-racist specialists support our schools through office hours weekly. And so anybody in the school can reach out to them to schedule some time to talk about anything in regard to racial equity. And so it may be work around our Affirmative Racial Equity tool and how they're embedding that into their instruction, it can be support around our equity monitoring progress tool, which is the EMPT, and I'm sure we'll get to that a little bit later on in the conversation. But they can provide insight and support to teacher, principal, any staff member within the building around those tools, or any other questions that they may have around racial equity, whether it's supporting, with implicit bias, or just giving them insight on that, whether it be microaggressions, anything you can think about in regard to racial equity. They pretty much are knowledgeable, and they do their due diligence, and so they do their work in order to be able to support schools in those ways. And so the question that you asked of me and was, how does BJ Bunton and DEP, those anti-racist specialists in particular, support this work? One, outside of what they do, schools reach out and they ask for us to come in and do racial equity walkthroughs. And so those racial equity walkthroughs are centered around our Affirming Racial Equity tool, which is the R tool. And so that is a tool that was developed by our department that helps support schools in their development of culturally responsive instruction pedagogy. And so schools will have us come out to provide them some insight in terms of where they are with those components of the R tool. And so we'll sit down with those principals after we've conducted walkthroughs, and our principals may have their instructional staff or their administrative team accompany us on those walkthroughs as well. And we'll sit down and we'll debrief and we'll talk about those areas where there are connections made, and then we provide considerations, and we give them a formal report within a day or two after that visit. Wow. And so it's up to the principal to take that information and decide how they want to best utilize that information and that feedback with their school, whether that be in PLC, whether they want to do an embedded PD, however they want to approach the work after their walkthrough, it's on them in terms of that. So we provide them with that insight. Then they need to move on it from there. And then our team is more than happy to circle back around. And so if principals want to reach back out after they have planned on next steps, and they may say, hey, Mr. Bunton, can your team come back out? We are focusing on equitable pedagogy in the R tool, which is one of the components. Can you come back around and take a look at where we are with this and provide us some more insight and feedback? We're more than glad to do that.
And that's something I talk with Dr. Stephanie White about, is having that evidence, right? So we conduct the walkthrough, principal may follow up and say, hey, can you come back? These are things that are at the end going to be tangible items that they can submit
absolutely
to your report, and that kind of helps you gauge and essentially track progress, right?
Right, to a certain extent. That's a small portion of the work that should be going on in schools, but it is. You're right. That is evidence that those schools can use in their equity monitoring progress tool that they submit at the end of the year, and that we take a look at and we provide insight and feedback on. And so, that is a great piece of evidence.
So what is I'm sure each walkthrough is different per school, per educator, per maybe metric or category that lens we're looking to do the walkthrough on. But on average, what is a typical walkthrough consist of? Are you engaging with teachers and students, or just kind of walk us through what that would look like?
Sure. Typically, the walkthroughs that we conduct, myself and my team, are about an hour and a half. So we spend close to an hour in a classroom, and depending on how many participate, like I said before, schools may decide to have their administrative team participate or other instructional leaders within the building. And so we'll break off in teams. We try not to inundate a class with too many people at the same time, so we try to limit it to 2 people per team. But the more teams we have, the more ground we can cover. And so in an hour's worth of time, we typically get into about 4 or 5 classes, about 10, 15 minutes apiece. And so just depending on the team, you may be able to cover a nice amount of ground in terms of that school during that time. When we come back from that hour, walkthrough, we'll sit down and we'll debrief. So each team will have an opportunity to be able to share out their connections that they saw, and then also considerations that they have based on the components of the Affirmative Racial Equity walkthrough tool. And so we do that for about 30 minutes, and then from there, like I said, our specialists will come together, and then they'll synthesize that information into a formal report and provide that information back to principals. And so during those walkthroughs, you may interact with the students a little bit. I kind of, when I go in, I take a holistic view and just step back and just kind of just take in the whole room.
Take it all in.
Take it all in at first. And then I work my way down to the students. So it may be a point where I do have some conversation with a student about the learning. And a lot of times that does happen just to get more insight into what it is that they're doing. Then our specialists tend to do the same thing. And so, people have their different, strategies in terms of how they conduct walkthroughs, but that's typically how we go about it.
Yeah. And I'm in on part of my role within DEP revolves around community and family engagement. I know just from the groups that I'm working with, I find myself in conversation with or around a lot of Title I schools. And so I know as a district, we have a focus on increasing funding for our Title I schools. Can you share anything in regards to where we are in that plan, or what the district's plan is on using those funds once they've been secured?
I could give you a brief snippet of what I participated in and what I do know. I was a part of our district's future state team in resource and high poverty schools, and so that team did a lot of legwork in terms of research and looking at other districts that were similar in size to Jefferson County Public Schools and what they were doing in those districts in terms of successful strategy around resourcing their schools that were of high poverty. And so we were able to come back and formulate a plan to take to Dr. Polio and the board in terms of what we think would be some good strategy and good things to have in place for our schools here that are of high poverty in our district. And so that's one thing. Another a piece that I know is coming is that tax levy that our board was able to pass that's going to generate, $58 million of additional funding yearly. And a portion of that will be going to support our schools that are choice zone schools, or our schools that are mainly comprehensive school improvement schools, which the makeup is majority minority, which is Black and brown students predominantly in those schools. And a lot of those schools are high poverty or Title I schools. And so I think close to $12 million, I believe, will be utilized to help support those schools in additional, programming and resources, staffing from year to year. Another piece that the district has done, and we have to credit Dr. Tom Aberly for his work in our finance department and Chief Cordelia Harden. Last year, they were able to put together a middle and high school equitable funding model. And this year, I was a part of a team that worked on the elementary funding model. And so that recently went to the board to present, and we'll be going back to the board for hopefully be passed. And so that's going to help increase revenue and resources in our schools that are high poverty, especially our schools in the West End of Louisville. In the choice zone area, we'll be receiving some additional funds. And like I said, just making things more equitable for our students that need it most.
Yeah. Well, in the spring, at the school level, schools provide what you would call fruits of your labor. That's essentially, like we've been saying, those tangible pieces of evidence that show progress towards meeting the racial equity goals. When those tangible pieces of evidence are weak, in maybe some cases non-existent, is that an indicator of non-compliance, or is that a lack of resources to help deliver or support that said goal?
The fruits of the labor and what we're talking about is the equity monitoring progress tool.
Correct.
And so each school is responsible for submitting their evidence and a narrative created around their evidence for those 5 policy tenets. But within that equity monitoring progress tool, there are 6 domains, but those 6 domains connect directly to our racial equity policy tenets. So schools are responsible for providing evidences around those 6 domains and a narrative to boot for the work that has occurred during the course of the year. So to answer your question, it's a little bit of both and.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You know, some schools may be doing some things out of compliance and, you know, may not put a great deal of effort into evidence in the work that has been done. Some of it may not be intentional. Some of it is they're doing some great things. They just are having trouble evidencing everything that they've done, you know, and it could be because of lack of system within their school. And so you can't sit here in bad schools, because I've sat in that seat. I was a principal for 8 years. So there's a lot of great things that are going on in schools that you may not think connect, but they do.
They do, yeah.
And they may be missing out on some of those opportunities by not evidencing that in that equity monitoring progress tool. And so sometimes when you connect with those principles, that's the verbiage you get. Well, we're doing such and such and such and such. But, you know, have you taken the time to evidence that and build a narrative around how it's moving the needle in your school for students? I wouldn't say it's from a lack of resources. We're resource heavy in our department. Now, I would say communication to schools about those resources that are available could be much better. And some of that is on us, but some of that is also on how it's being filtered down to them.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
And so that's a both and there to let them know what is available and how it can support them in the work. And so I hope that answered your question.
Absolutely. And I'm curious, and how this could be either from your parent hat, former principal hat, or executive administrator hat. Are there any indicators a parent or guardian could identify, something a little more indicative than a student or a student teacher not seeing eye to eye on a particular day, right? Is there anything that a parent or guardian could identify that a particular school community is not doing to meet the needs of their child?
No, those are, you know, simple things can be done. You know, is your student bringing home work samples so you can see the work that is occurring in the school? You know, is one easy way that a parent can kind of keep track of, you know, what's happening curricularly, you know, in a school. Just having that conversation with those teachers as well about, you know, what is my child supposed to be learning in this particular period of time, standard-wise, you know, and then seeing if the work that follows matches what that teacher is saying that should be, you know, taking place. You know, those are just some small things that, you know, parents could do. And just really be invested and involved, you know, in your child's education. So when we have parent-teacher conference days, you know, and I know parents have to work. I worked in a school where a lot of our parents are working 2 and 3 jobs, and they may not have the time, but there's time where you can, you know, set up some time outside of that conference day to have those conferences and those talks with, you know, those teachers to make sure your child is progressing the way they should. So there is a lot of different things that parents can do to really be invested and involved in what goes on in the school. Yeah,
because like I said, I would think, given our department being resource heavy, right?
Yeah.
If the system works, we will provide resources to our school communities on let's just say being more culturally responsive.
Right.
What does that look like in a classroom? Me as a parent or guardian, I know that this is a topic, right? A conversation. I believe that's the expectation.
Right.
So I should see evident in that in my child's homework or studies.
Yeah,
right?
and you want to see those pieces in there. And like I said, our schools have been asked to utilize the affirmative racial equity tool in their planning. And so it should be evident in their instruction in the work that's being sent home. And so, what we talk about windows and mirrors. And so in terms of the culturally responsive piece, so a mirror, you should be able to see yourself in the instruction. And so those things that are coming home, and also the work that's being provided, all right? And so those things that are coming home, as a parent, can be asking yourself that question too. Culturally, does this connect with my child?
Yeah.
And then also we should be having some windows. So you're also seeing into the lives of others. And so we're not just talking strictly, Black students, but also our students from our Hispanic and Latinx communities, or our students from the Asian community, or students that represent other ethnicities. So are you seeing some evidence in the work that's coming home and the resources that are being used to connect to those communities as well? So that's the windows and mirrors pieces. So those are some things that families can do.
Okay. And based on some of the metrics, whether the ones we highlighted last year or the ones you mentioned this year that were kind of new to me, based on some of these metrics, has the district seen progress within the racial equity plan? What areas of growth have we seen since last year?
We've done a phenomenal job in terms of increasing our number of administrators of color. And so that's one where we've had great gains.
That's awesome.
I'll give you an instance. 2018-19, we were about 17.2% administrators of color in the district as a whole. We're at 46.6 now. So that speaks volumes in the work that's being done to help bolster, that number. And so
which is,
go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry to cut you off that, but that's probably more, I would say, relative to our student body, right? Being a minority majority district, that increase should be the increase we were looking for.
Absolutely. And, we would hope to, see that, like you said. But even within that, so we had an increase of our total number of administrators of color, but there's still work to do because that number doesn't necessarily reflect our Latinx percentages for students. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so even though we've had some increase, and that's mainly from being our Black administrators of color, but we still have our Latinx community and also our Asian community that needs to have more representation in terms of administrators. And so there are several others. Ian, I know we're going.
I was gonna say that's you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Great work being done, but still a little road to go, which is fine. There's always room for growth.
Absolutely.
If there's anything BJ could tell, the BJ 2 years in now would tell BJ on day one in this role, what would that be?
Well, a few things, and some things that I've learned in 2 years. One, and I knew it be coming in, but it's even more relevant and needs to be more prevalent. Across the board, just having good systems in place around the work that we're doing, so you can do several things. So you can monitor the work that's taking place. But then the other piece, Ian, is that accountability piece. And so, what matters gets inspected pretty much. And so if you're saying and you're putting out there that something is important and it does matter to you individually or us as a district, then you have to take the time to really inspect and dig in to see if the work is occurring, and then also have to hold people accountable for doing those things to move the needle. And so those are some things that just really come to mind, and you know, that I applied in my years as a principal, but really when you're doing this work up here at the central office level, you know, has to really be in place.
Yeah. Well, BJ, as always, I enjoyed chopping it up with you.
Yes, sir.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for your time.
No, I appreciate you, Ian. Thanks.
All right, have a good one.
All right.